returning to our top story, and new explosions and fighting can be heard across the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. Ukraine's president is warning to expect Russian troops to storm the capital at any moment. It is very much a developing and evolving situation. Joining me now is independent journalist and co-founder of Declassified Australia, Antony Loewenstein. Good afternoon to you, Antony.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Antony, as we've heard throughout the afternoon, Russian forces are now inside the city limits. Explosions, gunfire can be heard. This is very much a developing and changing situation. Look, President Putin looks set on taking the capital. Will he stop at Ukraine? What are his ambitions?
Look, I think that's obviously the concern. I mean, there's no doubt and there's no real question that Putin's actions since invading Ukraine are illegal. They're against international law. They're against international humanitarian law. And sadly, Putin has form on this. I mean, let's not forget that Putin assisted Bashar al-Assad in Syria to win that war, and Russia committed hideous war crimes, as did Iran, against the people of Syria to assist Assad in winning that war. So sadly, Putin has form. In terms of Ukraine, I think there's no doubt, based on what Putin has been saying in the last weeks, but arguably years, is that his vision or view of Russian history is rather removed from reality. But essentially he says, Ukraine's not a real country. I don't recognise it as a real country. It's therefore part of Russia. It should never have been independent. And he therefore believes he has the right to go in and take that nation for himself or for the Russian people. I mean, it's important to note, of course, the number of Russians do not support that. And it's amazing and inspiring, in fact, to see in the last days small but certainly noticeable protests in Moscow and St. Petersburg of Russians saying, not in our name, this war is wrong and illegal. Of course, most of them were arrested for the simple act of dissent. I mean, this dissent is essentially almost illegal now in Russia. And there's no doubt that there is a question about what Putin's ambitions are beyond Ukraine. I think he certainly has a vision and a belief that a lot of the countries that were under the Soviet Union back in the day should not have been independent after the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 90s. And therefore, he believes it should be back part of Russia. Whether he launches military action to do that is another question.
Let's touch on NATO now. Obviously, NATO has condemned the invasion of Ukraine. The alliance will deploy troops to Ukraine's neighbours, will send weapons to Ukraine, including air defences, after Russia's attack. But what does this say about the viability of NATO? Will this strengthen the alliance?
Look, ironically, NATO, in fact, might be strengthened because I think a lot of nations in Europe that are not with NATO are now wanting to join, or at least discuss that, because they're scared that they might be next. So on the one hand, it may have the opposite effect of what Putin thinks should happen. On the other hand, I think it's really important to note that in many ways, NATO, I think, is a deeply problematic organisation. People might not remember this, but NATO's had a pretty troubling record in the last 20 years. It was involved in the war in Afghanistan. It was involved in the war in Libya. Both examples, a complete humanitarian disaster. NATO troops committed war crimes in both nations. And I think there's a real question around what does NATO represent after the Cold War. Now, that's not repeating what Putin said. Putin has said to some extent, well, we don't believe that NATO nations have a right to exist on our borders. And there's a legitimate question around any nation, let's say America or other nations had a country on its border that fundamentally disagreed with its own policies. That's a legitimate question to ask. But I think really NATO's viability is really now about what? Defending Europe from Russian aggression. That was not the agenda for a number of years. It was during the Soviet times. And what this really, I think, says is any kind of imperialism to me is bad, whether it's done by the US or it's done by Russia or China or any kind of nation. This is problematic. And if we condemn US aggression in Iraq or Afghanistan or Israeli actions in Palestine, we also have to condemn Russian imperialism. And I think what's happening in Ukraine and potentially further, I think puts great question into what kind of vision Putin has and indeed NATO has for the coming years.
You touched on America. There's no doubt the world will feel the ramifications of this. We're talking fuel, wheat, oil prices, etc. But what does this mean specifically for the US, though, and their energy prices and situation?
Look, in the US, there's already a conversation happening in the last days, and this is mostly from the right, but also from other parts of the US conversation, that it was a mistake. So the argument goes to not do much more fracking inside the US, to rely on outside countries for energy. I mean, let's face it, in the last years, much of Europe is quite reliant on Russia for energy, including gas. And it's interesting to see how that works moving forward. So the argument in parts of the Republican Party and some on the more conservative side of politics in the US is to say, we need to, as they say, drill, baby, drill. We need to extract more fossil fuels from inside the US to protect ourselves from countries like Russia. Now, under the Biden administration, who at least nominally believe in climate change and stopping the extraction of fossil fuels, at least on paper, I think it's unlikely they're going to start doing massive expansion of fracking, but I do think it really means there should be an acceleration in all countries, in fact, on renewable energy, because if you rely on countries like Saudi Arabia or Russia or others for your energy sources, they're autocrats, they're dictatorships. And that's a problem if they act in ways that you find very problematic, as Saudi does in Yemen, which is another war, I might add, that we're not talking about. And I only mention that because when we've had these conversations in the last few days about Russia is breaking the international order, the rules-based order, we hear this comment all the time by the Australian government, the US, the British. What does that actually mean? I mean, ultimately, there is a rules-based order on paper, but Russia would say, and a lot of other nations I think would agree, according to whom? Who makes those rules? I mean, is the US invasion of Iraq, was that a breach of a rules-based order? Yes. Was a 20-year occupation of Afghanistan? Arguably, yes. Was Russia's invasion of Ukraine that? Absolutely it was, and it is. But I think when we talk about a rules-based order, we have to think who's making those rules, and it's generally a handful of Western nations since World War II.
All right, we have to leave it there. Antony Loewenstein, thank you so much for your insight. We appreciate your time this afternoon. Take care.